there's a range of topics today, and as I said, it's not so much science, but it's going to touch on to various things about spiritual growth and religion as well, but in a sort of scientific slant to that. So you'll see how that turns out. I want to discuss how we act mentally, because in previous evenings I've talked about discrete degrees, and there have been many of those, so I want to explain a little bit how they connect together to produce mental actions which lead into physical actions. And then, once we know what an individual mental action is, then we can look at spiritual growth, mental growth from being a baby to being a child to being an adult to an older person into old age. And because there are many stages, we all think differently as we get older. We gain new skills to think, we ought to, we hope we are. And so it's possible to use these discrete degrees that I've talked about to see what those are. And then there's the question of how spiritual growth connects to religion, or how spiritual growth produces spiritual activity. Because if we just think about everyday things, it's a question of how that's connected to spirituality and religion. So there'll be some general comments there. And then there's the question of what happens after old age, okay? Is there an afterlife, living after the old age? And so I'll discuss using some ideas from Swedenborg about the general principles that govern the afterlife and how the afterlife is connected with the life that came before on Earth. So you'll see why it's necessary to have life on Earth, but then that gives some effects for a long time afterwards. About mental actions. I'll just say some general things. I talked about the bilateral symmetry and how you need love and wisdom. And so in the spiritual actions depend on love and wisdom combining, because wisdom provides the form and love provides the substance. I talked about love and substance in one of the first or second lectures. So obviously you can't have something without a substance and only a form. It's like a triangle with no meat in it. And you can't have substance without being in a form. So you've got to have substance and form together. And furthermore, the right love has to be in the right form, because you can imagine taking all the parts of your body and jumbling them up. They wouldn't function. So the substances might be there, the individual forms might be there, but the arrangement might not be correct. And so the love and wisdom are both needed. Substance, there has to be the right substance, wanting to do the right things, in a form on the right configuration in order for things to work properly. In the mental degree, mental action, you have to have thoughts and desires. Desires are needed to produce the mental actions, but thoughts are the way in which the mental actions are proceeding. So if you just act from desire without thinking, you probably already know what that means. And if you have thoughts without desire, then you'll probably already know what that means either. That's intellectual, disinterested rationality, which is not very useful. Psychology also has this pair. It talks about cognitive and affective processes. And a lot of the early work on psychology was cognitive, and then later on people realized that affective or emotional processes were needed. So Piaget, for instance, had a whole stages of cognitive growth. Then Erik Erikson came along with a similar pattern of affective or emotional growth, and actually I show in the book that they relate at each level. There's an overlap between them. There's a pairing, a kind of what I call a marriage of equals. Love and wisdom have to be married together of the right kind at each level. And eventually, mental actions produce physical results, which was good, because mental actions by themselves are not very good. Oh, well, they're interesting, but they don't actually do anything. So now I come to mental growth, okay? I talked about this, in the previous talk about the sensory mind and then a scientific rational and an irrational. And we normally think that we start off as a child or a baby with just being able to do things with our hands and eyes, but later on we think more internally, and then we get more internal thinking. So mental growth is the awakening of new degrees above the present consciousness. And so the question is how that happens. And Swedenborg has some particular ideas about remains, but I'm going to talk about it in a slightly more general way. I'm going to say that in order to get a new level of consciousness, we need a framework in order to hold this new level of consciousness. So that means we need new actions that provide a framework. So the question is then how you produce the new actions, and this is where Swedenborg's remains come in. These are, he says, these are motivations and desires stored up in your spiritual life from when you were very young, and they're used in order to prompt new growth. You don't think of them as yourselves, but they're used in order as a seed for the new growth. So they can produce new actions, and once you've made an action, then the new life, you can fit into a new habit. And so the new actions must be ultimately physical, because when we went down the level of discrete degrees, we come to the physical, and only at the physical level do we have permanent historical events. That's sort of the bottom line. The very outermost skin for all of creation is the physical level. And so I say physical actions are what are needed to provide permanent changes. And once you've got the physical actions, then new thoughts and affections can be present and effective. They can persist. Because if you just have a new idea that doesn't lead to a physical action, then you tend to forget it. I don't know if you've noticed this. If you just have a dream in the middle of the night, it might seem wonderful, but if you don't actually do anything on the basis of those new ideas, then the dream just evaporates, it's just gone. But if you get taught a new idea at school or university and you immediately have some project to use it, to do some exercises or to think about an investigative activity, then this is a way of forming a permanent framework in which these new ideas can remain and persist. So this is what I say follows from the kind of theism that we're talking about here. I'm going to list some what I call bad ideas for spiritual growth. Now the font here is rather small. The first one, sometimes people think of spiritual growth as expanding one's consciousness or rotating it, looking up or vibrating in a certain way. But even expanding our consciousness to the whole universe doesn't make us to have a new level of love. No matter how big we are or small we are in terms of size, it doesn't tell us, doesn't produce new loves, because discrete degrees are not a question of size. Another bad idea is belief. It's not just a question of believing something is true, because that's only in the understanding. It's only in the ideas and the rationality, maybe, rather than to do with love. So love and wisdom have to combine to produce actions, and right down to the physical, before you can have permanent changes. And so belief by itself is not sufficient for spiritual growth unless it's active in your life. You may know that already, I hope so. And similar to that is knowledge. And I say knowledge even of what things that are true. Even if you read the best spiritual philosophy and read wonderful ideas, you may have done this as a teenager, and you think you know everything, but you realize you haven't actually applied it at all, and it's all intellectual exercise. So it's like faith alone, to just have ideas and no application. Similarly, blind obedience by itself doesn't produce spiritual growth, because blind obedience might produce the right actions. It's useful at the beginning to try out new actions, but unless it's fleshed out from love and wisdom together to justify and produce and these actions and then provide a framework to use them in life, then blind obedience by itself is no good. Obedience is only good if it's not blind. If it's obedience from love and wisdom, then that's the right kind. Similarly, good intentions or love. Many people say all you need is love. But the question is, love of what? I mean, you can think of all the sort of things that you might well love. Alcohol, for instance, are not a route to spiritual growth. So when you say all you need is love, you have to immediately ask, what sort of love are we talking about? If we're talking about love of being useful to other people, then that's a step in the right direction. But in order for that to be useful for spiritual growth, it has to be informed by an understanding and a wisdom about how to be useful to other people. You've probably heard of young youth groups being sent off to foreign countries to do all wonderful things because this is the things that they know they should be doing. But it's a question of how to do that is an interesting question. Finally, I'll add something a little bit more controversial. Suffering, okay? Suffering by itself is not sufficient for spiritual growth. Suffering by itself is something that happens to us rather than something that we do. There are many cases of suffering, but what is spiritually important is how we respond to the suffering. Suffering is sometimes useful to get us out of ways that are not good and suggest the need for new ways. But just having suffered is not a way of spiritual growth. It's like a widow wearing black after her husband died at the age of 22. She wears black for the rest of her life. She suffers forever. That's not by itself a way of spiritual growth. Okay, now we come to some of the more technical details. Last week, I think I handed out a sheet, but probably no one's brought the sheet again. So I'm going to show the relevant parts on the slide, okay? I think these two boxes were on separate pages, separate slides. So I'm going to give some consequences of these. I'm going to use these degrees, in particular these middle 3 degrees, to describe mental growth from childhood to old age, and also to discuss the afterlife. So I'm going to, on the later slides, I'm going to repeat the relevant parts of this ennead of 9 degrees. Okay? So let's just consider the middle column of those 3. So if you look on the previous slide, oh no. Oh dear. Okay, the mental column is this one here. That's the interesting one, because I'm going to talk about growth of the mind. That's the main focus for the next part of this talk. So we consider just the mind, and the first part of it is the bottom third of that middle column of 3. And this is thoughts of actions, or exterior mind, or knowledge, just simple knowledge about facts. And this is, if we look at what Erickson or Piaget say about what stages of life you're living in this degree, so to speak, we talk about childhood from 0 to 8. And Piaget has various internal stages to this whole 2.3 degree, I call it. It's the second column and the third one down. So in the book, I go into the separate ingredients of this, but for now, I just take it as a whole. So growth starts here. Growth starts at the bottom. The growth of the mind of the child starts at the beginning and builds up this. So the next stage is a rational understanding, scientific rational. And this corresponds to what Piaget calls operational stage, and then formal stage, and then what other people have called the creative stage, from ages about 10 to 25. So this is sort of high school intellectual activity, and then kind of creative self-motivation. It's learning to be self-motivated, learning to think formally, and learning to do things in a reliable way. So this is the middle degree, and that's, I call scientific rational, because scientific thinking is mostly on that level, and creativity is needed there as well. But what's interesting is that there's a 2.1, a level above the scientific rational, which I call interior rational, which is, the outer one is thoughts of actions, thoughts of thoughts, or formal things, thoughts of love. So as we get older, we think more about how we love. We don't just think about ideas. When we're at university, we might be thinking about ideas, but we're beginning to think about how one loves with one's life. And when you think about love, you think about, first of all, you think about the actions that follow from loving, and then you think about the thoughts involved, and then the underlying motivations. So there are stages in here, in this 2.1 degree, I call it. Piaget and Erikson. Oh, okay. Erikson has some degrees here, which John Gowan has adapted them in a way which I think is more useful. He talks about a generative stage and ego integrity. And then this is where, when you get to this 2.1, this is where spiritual regeneration begins, as you begin to think more about love. Because as you think about love in your life, you notice that some loves in your life are not really what you want them to be. So you learn to distinguish the good loves from the not so good loves, and you learn to choose one rather than the other. Finally, there are levels in each of these that we could discuss, but that would get even more technical. But they're in the book if you want to look at more details. So going up through this middle section is what life on earth does, okay? From 0 to old age, you end up going through those stages. So the question is how you get to regenerate. How does religious activity begin in this framework? And I want to say that serious spiritual growth begins in adulthood. It's a known feature that when you get to the age of responsibility, late teens, 20s, this is when your actions make those for which you are responsible, and you start to think about love. And before you have any religious or spiritual life, you're in what I call that middle scientific rational. You're thinking about formal things, scientific things, frameworks, philosophical frameworks maybe, but they're sort of airtight frameworks. I don't know if you know what an ideology is. It's a generalized set of ideas that explain everything. And you must have met people who have, Marxism or Freudianism, whatever, are ideologies which explain everything. And those are scientific ideas. Although they should have been scientific ideas, even if they weren't. So the question is how you open up, how you crack the shell of the 2.2 to get to the 2.1. And so you need to open it up. There has to be some way of recognizing that there is some illumination, something from God that comes in from that 2.1, that interior rational, into the scientific thoughts. So many scientists don't think this, but those people that do have had beginning of spiritual or rational or religious life see that they can look to God rather than just relying on their own thought. And I call this day one, because if you think of Genesis, on the next slide I'll show all of Genesis. But day one is let there be light, okay? There's a crack in the roof of the sky, and light shines in. That's the first step of spiritual life. And once you have a spiritual life, you have light shining in, and you see things in the light of that spiritual life. This is what I talked about earlier, about wisdom shines in, shines on your ideas, shines on your desires, shines on your life, and you can then look at it in the light of that wisdom and see whether it looks good. And if you see things that are not good, you have to decide not to do them. That's basically what regeneration is. It's deciding not to do the things that don't look good. And in that process, you're deciding to do things, you actually do things, you make new actions which provide a new framework for new interior degrees. And you can go through the stages of those, that topmost 2.1, I call it 2.1x, 2.1.1, 2.1.2, and so on. So there are 3 stages there. I call them days 2, 3, and 4. We'll see in the next slide what days 2, 3, and 4 are. But then I claim, along the Swedenborg, that spiritual growth is completed in the afterlife. It's begun in our minds, but then it goes to that first column, which is where love really is. That's our sort of soul, so to speak. So when we're living on earth, we have feelings, we have thoughts, we have desires, but our activity in the spiritual, that first column, is is something that only happens briefly while we're living on earth. We don't actually live in it permanently until we've died, and we'll see why that is in a minute. So I say moving into the 1 point x, and I call it, there's 3 degrees there in the first column, so that stays 5, 6, and 7. And so the result of this process of spiritual growth is escaping the scientific rational, and those you know from what scientific rational is, what the image is of Egypt in the Bible is used to refer to the scientific rational. This is why I call this out of Egypt in the title here. Spiritual growth is taking oneself out of Egypt into spiritual life, into the land of Canaan, so to speak. So I've talked about days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We can, oops, no. Yes, 7 days of creation. Now this is a table, so I can't do it in the stages. So we can see that this is the representation of what the first chapter of Genesis describes happens on these days. The initial state is without form and void. This is no spiritual form. In other words, we're still in Egypt at that point. We're still in the scientific rational. The first step is light and darkness, is to see that there is light as distinct from darkness. In other words, knowing that good and true are higher than the thinking that comes from oneself. So that's breaking into that interior rational. But once you're in the interior rational, you have to separate. The waters above are distinguished into the heavens and the earth. That's what has Genesis. So that we're separating 2 things. We're separating the good that comes from God and the good that comes from yourself, and learning to discriminate. In other words, it's about actions, which is the first step. And then, on the third state, we have tender grass and fruit trees. So then we're acting from ideas. Grass, to go back to the plants we had earlier, grass is green, it receives light, but there's not really any fruit to it. Okay, it's a very preliminary and basic understanding of wisdom. It's the simplest understanding as you have before there are fruit trees, before there's fruit, before you're doing things. You have to begin with grass, but then the fruit trees come. So you're still acting from ideas. And then the fourth state, which is the end of this interior rational, the sun and moon appear. And so we have love and insight begin in our minds. So these second, third, and fourth states are all, well, I think of them as in the 2.1s. They're still this interior rational. And then later on, we have three more states. This is going into the spiritual world, in which we have whales and birds, deep principles and rising thoughts. Then we have an image of God, which is what Swedenborg calls spiritual, which comes from wisdom. And then finally we have a likeness of God, which is acting from love rather than just insight. And that's what Swedenborg calls celestial. So these last 3 are the growth into the spiritual world. And I said here they're explained in more detail by Swedenborg's Volume 1. So these show that the basic stages that we had, the growth through these stages, is a story, it's the adventure of one's life, okay? And someone understood the adventure of this life at an early stage and wrote the Bible using that kind of wisdom. And Swedenborg has explained how these 2 columns are related to each other. I said that spiritual growth was completed in the afterlife. So then the question is, what is the relation between the afterlife and the life on earth? So I think we'll come to an end soon. So here's my 9-fold box, but I've coloured them. There's a sort of orangey green here, actual physical processes, and there's a green, this metal is called labeled green. So during our life, we're building up in these discrete degrees. So we're building up actions in the physical degree down here. because those are the permanent, ultimate physical effects, the skin, so to speak, of all of creation. And we're building up the mental degree. I talked about all the stages from youth to old age in building up this mental degree. So during our life on earth, we have actions here, and we have mental growth, we have thoughts and affections of all kinds in this mental degree in the middle. But at death, we lose the physical degree, okay? It's chopped off. It's no longer us, okay? So the question is, how can we function if we only have love and mind there? We want an answer to how we would do things, because so there must be some actions that keep our loves together, our personality, our life. There must be something constant in our life after we die in order to make ourselves recognizably ourselves. We can't just go and change into anything arbitrarily. So the question is, what is determining the afterlife? And Swedenborg has an explanation for this, and I've adapted Swedenborg's explanation in terms of the discrete degrees here. What seems to be important, according to Swedenborg, is what are the spiritual loves in our life? What are the loves that have motivated us to do things? And also, according to Swedenborg, the interior rational ideas, this inner rational. He says you have to have formed something in the inner rational in order to have a life of character after you've died, after bodily death. And Swedenborg talks about a limbus, or some inner physical substances, which also need to be formed. So these three things here are the first row of each of those three columns. According to Swedenborg, you need to have the inner love has to be formed, and it's formed on the basis of the interior rational. You have to have formed some religious ideas of your own. So it doesn't matter what religion you have, as long as you've used it to form some religious ideas by means of which you've lived your life and you can distinguish between what's good and what's not good. So it's a universalism in that sense. It's not required of specific revelation, but it has some basic requirements about oneself. You need to have discriminated between good loves and not good loves in your life, and the good loves have to have led to action and form something in the physical. You need to have some interior ideas which enable you to discriminate, and you have to have some initial love which is good rather than not good. So it's a general feature that in these discrete degrees there are causations goes down. So in general, thoughts and sensations follow from the loves. This is what Swedenborg describes the spiritual world as like. And so the way I'm going to represent that here is to say that thoughts and sensations do follow from the loves, but they're not disturbed by physical events. And I'm going to do it by putting those are actually little earrings. So I'm saying that the blue row is things that are constant. The blue row is constant as you go from this life to the next. There's something in those to the physical, there's some interior rational understanding of what good is, and there's a love which drives it. Those are the things which are constant from this life into the afterlife. But these lower degrees they hang like earrings from the blue row. In other words, the thoughts you have just follow from your mind and your love, rather than just determined by physical. So you're no longer constrained by the actual physical processes, except insofar as they've made this internal structure. So I'm trying to explain what parts of the physical life, what parts of living in the world are important when you're living on earth and you're going through that middle degree of growth. The spiritual loves on the left are sort of just beginning to awaken. They're not very much alive at all. And in the afterlife, it will be very frustrating, someone said to me, to have only love and ideas not being able to do anything. You know how frustrating it is in your life if you have some good idea about helping, but you can't do anything. That's very frustrating. So, I call this a clever combination. So, I say afterlife people have the spiritual ideas, and so they have the spiritual loves, and they generate the new ideas, and the people on earth receive the new ideas and then act physically. So that they act in tandem. The heavens, the spiritual world, is where people live with fully awakened loves, and they generate ideas, and then we're living on earth, and many ideas pop into our mind, don't they? We don't plan all of our ideas. You're just daydreaming. All sorts of ideas come into your mind. Even when you're thinking, trying to think logically, all sorts of ideas come into your mind. So the ideas are produced like a waterfall, so to speak, from the spiritual world. They come into our minds, and we select those ones we want, and then we take the ones we want, and we choose them, and then we act on them, and produce the physical result. So the combination together of the spiritual world and the physical world works as a whole satisfactory cascading of waterfall, cascading intentions. And so the spiritual world supply the first stages, and we on earth carry it on out into the ultimate physical actions. So this is what people in the spiritual world do. They manage the loves, they sort out the loves, then they use them to produce ideas which they then use to inspire us to do all sorts of things we might want to do. And that way, we all do something useful, okay? And we all enjoy doing our bit in the process. We enjoy producing the physical actions, because there's a certain power in physical actions, but the spiritual world people like doing things with love, they like producing ideas, good ideas, and suggesting things to people, and they all do something useful. Okay? That's the end.